The air was thick with ash and the faint tang of rust, a smell Jake had grown too familiar with. The city had been lifeless for as long as he could remember, its towering buildings now skeletal remains draped in vines and cracked concrete. At 12, Jake had become an expert scavenger, able to tell at a glance which rubble piles might yield something useful. He'd learned to keep his head down, avoid trouble, and always save enough energy for the long trek back to the underground bunker where his family waited. Jake's stomach growled as he kicked through a heap of debris near what used to be a marketplace. His hands were numb from the cold, and he hadn't eaten since yesterday's stale crust of bread. He scanned the area for anything edible, glancing nervously at the shadows in case scavengers, or worse, predators, were watching. A glint of light caught his eye from a pile of junk at the corner of a crumbled storefront. He crouched down and brushed aside some dirt and broken glass, revealing a smooth, metallic surface that shimmered in the pale sunlight. It didn't look like a piece of machinery or debris. This was something else entirely. His heart quickened. Treasure? A tool? Anything of value could mean a better meal or supplies in trade. As he reached out, the object twitched. Jake froze. He squinted and saw it move again, a faint shiver coursing through its surface. Then, with a soft, pitiful sound, the thing unfolded slightly. It wasn't an object at all, it was alive. Jake's first instinct was to run, but something about the creature stopped him. It was no bigger than a cat, curled up in a tight ball of shimmering scales. It had an elongated snout and delicate, angular wings that looked tattered and useless. Its skin shifted colors as it moved, a mesmerizing swirl of blues, greens, and silvers. The creature made a low whimpering sound that tugged at Jake's heart. He crouched closer, cautiously extending a hand. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind. The creature flinched but didn't run. It looked weak, trembling as if it hadn't eaten in days or maybe weeks. Jake recognized the look. He'd seen it too many times in the mirror. Reaching into his pocket, Jake pulled out the small chunk of bread he'd managed to save from yesterday. It was hard and stale, hardly enough to silence his own hunger, but he couldn't ignore the creature's pitiful state. His fingers hovered over the bread for a moment, his stomach twisting at the thought of giving up his only food. But then he thought of his mom's words, "Kindness is the last form of magic we have." Sighing, he held the bread out. "Here," he whispered, nudging the bread closer to the creature. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." The creature's large, luminous eyes locked onto him, a mixture of caution and desperation. Slowly, it extended a clawed hand to grasp the bread. Jake tensed, but the creature's touch was surprisingly gentle. It sniffed the bread, then nibbled at it delicately. As it ate, its scales began to glow faintly, a soft radiance that spread from its snout to the tips of its damaged wings. Jake stared, his breath caught in his throat. The glow brightened slightly, casting a warm light over the rubble around them. For a moment, the dreary city seemed to come alive again, as though the creature's luminescence could push back the darkness. When the bread was gone, the creature let out a contented chirp and looked up at Jake with an expression that seemed almost grateful. Jake smiled despite himself, the warmth from the glow chasing away the chill in his bones. "What are you?" he asked softly, as if expecting an answer. The creature blinked, its gaze unblinking and ancient. It didn't respond, but it didn't flee either. Instead, it curled up near his feet, its scales still faintly shimmering. Jake felt an odd sense of companionship, as though this strange, fragile being was now tied to him in some way. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, and Jake realized he had to get back to the bunker before dark. Trouble lurked in the shadows of the ruins, and he couldn't risk being caught outside. But he couldn't leave the creature here either. "All right, little guy," Jake said, scooping it up carefully. It was lighter than he expected, its body warm against his arms. "You're coming with me." As he made his way back to the bunker, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he just stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that would change his life forever. But for now, it was just a strange, shimmering creature and a boy with nothing left but hope. The trek back to the bunker was a tense one. Jake moved quickly through the ruins, keeping to the shadows and scanning for any signs of danger. The creature in his arms remained still, its faint glow dimming as though it understood the need for stealth. The city ruins were no place to linger after dark. Scavengers, both human and animal, prowled the streets in search of their next meal. Jake had learned long ago to avoid eye contact and keep moving. When he finally reached the concealed entrance to his family's bunker, a narrow crack in the earth hidden beneath the collapsed overpass, he exhaled in relief. He squeezed through the opening, cradling the creature carefully. The rough walls of the tunnel scraped against his shoulders, but he knew every turn and dip by heart. At the bottom, the dim light of a single solar-powered lamp flickered faintly, illuminating the small, cramped space that served as home for Jake, his mother, and his younger sister, Ellie. "Jake? Is that you?" His mother's tired voice called from the corner where she sat stitching together scraps of fabric to make clothing. Her face lit up with a mixture of relief and concern when she saw him. "You're late." "I was starting to worry." "Sorry, Mom," Jake replied, setting his scavenged bag on the floor. He hesitated before revealing the creature. I found something." Ellie, a curious 8-year-old with wide eyes that always seemed to sparkle with wonder no matter how dire their situation, scrambled over. "What is it? Did you find food? Or maybe tools?" "Not exactly," Jake said, holding out the shimmering creature. Its faint glow returned as it stirred in his arms, blinking slowly at the new surroundings. Ellie gasped, her small hands flying to her mouth. "It's so pretty." Is it dangerous?" "I don't think so," Jake said. "It was starving when I found it. Gave it my bread. It ate it and, well, started glowing." His mother frowned, her expression a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Jake, we can barely feed ourselves, and you gave your food to this?" Jake's stomach churned with guilt, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "It looked like it was dying, Mom. I couldn't just leave it." The creature chirped softly, its luminous eyes scanning the room as if sensing the tension. Ellie crouched down to look closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are we going to call it?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Call it?" Jake repeated, surprised. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "I guess Spark? Since it glows and all." Ellie beamed. "Spark. I love it." Jake's mother sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Jake, this is reckless. We don't even know what it is. It could be dangerous. It could attract scavengers. What if it gets sick and spreads something to us?" Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Spark interrupted with a soft hum. It hopped out of Jake's arms and landed lightly on the floor. Its scales shimmered brighter, illuminating the small bunker. Ellie clapped her hands, delighted. Even Jake's mother looked momentarily captivated by the soft, warm light that filled the space. "It's not just glowing," Ellie whispered. She pointed toward the far side of the room where the faint light revealed something Jake hadn't noticed before, a narrow crack in the wall, just wide enough to slip through. Spark approached the crack, tilting its head curiously, before turning to look back at Jake as if urging him forward. "What's it doing?" Jake asked, following Spark's gaze. "Maybe it's trying to show us something," Ellie suggested, tugging at Jake's sleeve. Jake glanced at his mother, who sighed in resignation. "Just be careful," she said. "Don't go too far." With Spark leading the way, Jake and Ellie squeezed through the crack, finding themselves in a narrow tunnel. The faint glow from Spark's scales illuminated the jagged walls, and the siblings moved cautiously, their excitement mingling with apprehension. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the light revealed what lay within, shelves filled with canned goods, bags of preserved food, and dusty containers that looked untouched for years. "It's a stash," Jake whispered in disbelief. A food stash. Ellie's eyes widened. Spark found it. Jake, it knew this was here. Spark chirped proudly, its glowing scales casting a warm light over the treasure trove. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd given up his last piece of bread to save the creature, and now it had led them to enough food to last for weeks, maybe months. Back in the bunker, their mother's stern expression softened as she took in the haul. She looked at Spark with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. Maybe this wasn't such a reckless decision after all. Jake smiled, stroking Spark's shimmering scales. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something close to hope. Spark had given them a second chance, proof that sometimes, even in the bleakest times, a little kindness could spark something extraordinary. The days that followed Spark's discovery of the hidden food stash were transformative. For the first time in years, Jake and his family had enough to eat. The shelves of canned goods and preserved supplies became their lifeline, providing not only sustenance but also a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. Jake's mother even managed a rare smile as she prepared meals, her worry lines softening, at least for a little while. Spark had become a fixture in their lives. The shimmering creature stayed close to Jake, following him wherever he went and chirping softly whenever he spoke to it. It was more than a pet, it felt like a friend, one that understood him in a way even his family couldn't. Spark's scales would glow brighter whenever Jake was near, and it seemed to delight in his presence. Ellie adored Spark, often spending hours sitting next to it, her small fingers tracing the intricate patterns of its iridescent scales. Jake couldn't help but notice that Spark's presence seemed to lift everyone's spirits, as though its glow carried with it a subtle warmth that chased away the ever-present gloom of their world. One evening, Jake decided to test Spark's abilities. The creature had already demonstrated its knack for uncovering hidden resources, and Jake wondered just how far that skill went. "Hey, Spark," Jake said, crouching down beside the creature. Its glowing eyes turned toward him, tilting its head in that curious way that always made Jake smile. "Think you can help me find something else? Maybe fresh water this time?" Spark chirped and hopped to its feet, its scales shimmering with renewed brightness. Ellie clapped her hands excitedly. "You're taking Spark out? Can I come?" Jake hesitated. The city was dangerous, and Ellie was still small, but her pleading eyes made it impossible to refuse. "Okay," he said with a sigh. "But you have to stay close, Ellie. No wandering off." "Promise," she said, slipping on her worn boots. Jake grabbed a small backpack and a scavenger's pole, then led the way out of the bunker. Spark darted ahead, its glow illuminating the path as they climbed through the narrow tunnel and emerged into the ruins above. The city was eerily quiet, the setting sun casting long shadows over the broken buildings. Jake scanned the area cautiously before motioning for Ellie and Spark to follow. Spark moved with purpose, its glow flickering as it sniffed the air and darted toward a series of crumbled structures. As they followed, Jake noticed something strange. Spark seemed to sense danger before it appeared. It stopped abruptly, its scales dimming as it let out a low, warning hum. Jake froze, his heart pounding. Moments later, a pack of feral dogs emerged from a nearby alley, snarling and snapping at one another over a scrap of meat. Jake pulled Ellie behind a rusted car, holding his breath as the dogs fought among themselves. Spark remained perfectly still, its glow dimming to near invisibility. After a tense moment, the dogs lost interest and wandered off, disappearing into the shadows. Jake let out a shaky sigh. "You saved us," he whispered to Spark, who chirped softly in response. After what felt like hours of navigating the ruins, Spark stopped in front of a cracked concrete wall overgrown with weeds. It pawed at the ground, its glow brightening as it let out an insistent chirp. Jake knelt down, brushing aside the debris, and found a small trickle of water seeping from a crack in the ground. "Fresh water," Ellie exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. Jake filled a small bottle from his pack, testing the water cautiously. It was clean and cool, better than anything they'd found in months. He grinned, looking at Spark. "You're amazing," he said, patting its head. Spark chirped, its scales glowing brightly as if basking in his praise. As they made their way back to the bunker, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Spark was more than just lucky. There was something extraordinary about the creature, something he didn't fully understand yet. Back at the bunker, his mother listened intently as Jake and Ellie recounted the day's events. She looked at Spark with a mixture of wonder and suspicion. "Jake," she said slowly, "it's almost like Spark. Knows things. Finds things no one else can." Jake nodded. "I think so too. It's like it's helping us, leading us to what we need." "Maybe it's more than that," Ellie piped up. "Maybe Spark's like magical." Jake laughed softly. "Magic doesn't exist, Ellie. At least, not anymore." But as he watched Spark curl up at his feet, its shimmering scales casting a warm light over the bunker, he couldn't help but wonder if Ellie was right. Spark wasn't just a creature, it was a miracle. That night, as Jake drifted off to sleep with Spark glowing softly beside him, he dreamed of endless possibilities. He dreamed of a world where kindness wasn't a rare commodity, where creatures like Spark weren't an anomaly, but a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still light to be found. Jake woke to the soft hum of Spark's glowing scales. The faint warmth the creature radiated had become a comfort to him, like the embrace of a friend who never left his side. But this morning, the hum was different, sharper, more insistent. Spark was perched near the hidden stash in the adjacent chamber, its luminous eyes fixed on the shelves of food as if waiting for Jake to notice. "What is it, Spark?" Jake asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Ellie stirred beside him, waking up just in time to see Spark hop down and begin pacing toward the tunnel entrance. "It wants us to follow," Ellie whispered, excitement flashing in her eyes. Jake glanced at his mother, who was already awake, sitting by the small solar lamp. She nodded, her expression both curious and cautious. "Go ahead," she said. "Just be careful." Jake, Ellie, and Spark navigated through the ruins, the now familiar glow of Spark lighting the way. But this time, Spark moved with a distinct urgency. It darted ahead, stopping only to make sure Jake and Ellie were following before leading them deeper into parts of the city Jake had never dared explore. The air grew colder, and the ruins around them became more ominous. Buildings leaned precariously, their skeletal structures groaning in the wind. Yet Spark seemed unbothered, its glow pulsing steadily as it guided them forward. Finally, the creature stopped in front of an ancient library, its grand facade cracked and overrun with vines. "The old library," Jake murmured. He'd heard stories about this place, how it once held knowledge from a world long gone, but also rumors that it was cursed or guarded by something dark. He swallowed his nerves and followed Spark inside. The interior was eerie and silent, the once grand shelves now sagging under the weight of dust and decay. Spark led them through the labyrinth of crumbled shelves and scattered books, its glow growing brighter with each step. Eventually, they reached the back of the library, where Spark stopped in front of a massive, toppled shelf. Jake hesitated. "What's so important about this?" Spark chirped, its scales flashing brightly, illuminating something hidden beneath the debris. Jake and Ellie worked together to move the fallen pieces of wood and rubble, revealing a small alcove carved into the wall. Inside, they found something extraordinary, a strange, ancient-looking device covered in alien symbols and glowing faintly with the same iridescent light as Spark's scales. "What is it?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake carefully picked up the device, which felt warm and alive in his hands. The alien symbols shifted and glimmered as though responding to his touch. Spark chirped excitedly and hopped closer, nudging Jake's arm with its snout. Jake noticed a book resting beside the device, its cover marked with the same alien symbols. He opened it, revealing detailed sketches of creatures that looked like Spark, accompanied by what appeared to be instructions or descriptions written in a language he couldn't understand. At the bottom of one page, however, there was a translation scrawled in faint, uneven handwriting. The bonded ones, rare creatures that connect with a single human, granting them access to hidden knowledge, protection, and resources. They appear in times of great need, their bonds unbreakable, their fates intertwined with those they choose. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Spark. Bonded with me, he whispered, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The simple act of kindness had sealed a connection with this extraordinary creature, a bond that had already saved his family more than once. Ellie's eyes widened. So that's why Spark helps us. It's part of who it is. As Jake continued to skim the book, he found diagrams of the glowing device. It appeared to be some kind of locator or key, designed to lead bonded pairs human and creature to a place referred to only as sanctuary. According to the notes, sanctuary was a haven where survivors and bonded creatures could live safely, free from the dangers of the ruined world. Jake's mind raced as he pieced everything together. Spark hadn't just led them to food or water by chance. It had been guiding them towards something greater, something more permanent, a chance at survival, at hope. He turned to Spark, who chirped and nuzzled his hand, its glowing scales brighter than ever. You've been trying to show us this the whole time, haven't you? Jake said, his voice filled with awe. Spark chirped again, hopping in excitement. Ellie tugged on Jake's sleeve. So, are we going to Sanctuary? Jake looked down at the glowing device in his hands. If the book was correct, this was the map they needed to find Sanctuary. The journey would be dangerous, but staying in the city, even with Spark's help, would only delay the inevitable. He nodded, determination hardening in his chest. Yes. We're going to Sanctuary. That night, back in the bunker, Jake explained everything to his mother. Though skeptical at first, she couldn't deny the strange chain of events that had unfolded since Spark had entered their lives. Finally, she agreed. Early the next morning, they packed what little they could carry, storing the glowing device and the book carefully in Jake's bag. Spark led the way as the family set out into the unknown, their hearts heavy with both fear and hope. As they left the ruins of the city behind, Jake glanced back one last time, the weight of the world he'd known fading with each step. Spark chirped beside him, its scales glowing brilliantly in the morning light. For the first time in years, Jake felt something he thought he'd lost forever, the belief that there was still a future worth fighting for. Spark had given him that. And together, they would find their way to Sanctuary, whatever and wherever it might be.